qué hay espantos aquí?
Sí, momias, espíritus malignos, duendes, resucitados, monstruos, calaveras y brujas.
If you ever travel to the Yucatan Peninsula, it is most likely you have heard of cenotes. If you don't know what they are basically large craters with water filling most of it. The Mayans used them as a place of sacrifice. My mother says that they were given life and that they grew an appetite for human blood. At least, that's how they explained why tourists and explorers go missing from time to time. But that's a story for another time. The indigenous families that have lived there for thousands of years are very careful when they travel to El Monte or to around the cenotes. My grandpa told me why. He said that los serpientes guard them. These serpents are not like anything known to us. These serpents can fly, not glide from tree to tree as other snakes can. These snakes have wings that can expand like a cobra's that take them to large distances. They are described to be about 1 meter long, and their wings go down through most of its body, and their eyes have different color, sometimes red or green. In some cases, they can mimic humans. When my grandpa was about 12 years old, he and his father would go out gathering crops and go hunting. It was a bright, hot day, and they were going in deep into the jungle around the midday. They split up as he was asked to check a couple traps on one side while his father checked the other side. He decided to take a quick water break. He sat down under the shade and enjoyed the birds singing. It then grew very quiet, but he didn't think much of it. But then he heard rustling of dirt and leaves in front of him. What emerges is this snake with big, almost reflective red eyes. Almost hypnotized, he froze. Quickly gathering his composure, he slowly sneaks his hand to his machete. The snake notices and hissed violently and displayed part of its wings. His blood went cold. Should he scream and run, or should he stay? Either way, the outcome looked very grim. What felt like an eternity, but was most likely a couple minutes, it spoke in a very airy, raspy-like voice. Finally, he reacted, but only to cover his face, and he began to cry and whimper, fearing for his life that would soon come to an end. He then felt a large gust of wind. Shaking, his eyes looked above him to see the serpent flying into the branches. Not second-guessing it, he ran back to the meeting spot. As he emerged from the brush, he found his dad, confused and concerned. He asked what happened. Now bursting into tears, he told him about the snake with his wings and how it told him to run. His dad had a terrified look in his eyes, but he just told him that they were going home. Once they arrived, his mom did a cleansing on him to protect him from the snakes. It seemed to work, since he never saw that snake again, and he refused to go into the jungle alone. Later that day, his dad told him that those snakes were sacred and dangerous, and that they would live in the cenotes, and they would emerge to bring warning or to kill you, and that he was very lucky to be alive. My grandpa has since passed away, but before he died, he told me that he could still hear the snake telling him to run. My grandmother told me this story. This also included my two older aunts and my mother, which they all remembered quite clearly. Back in the day, they lived in a village and their homes were very spread out, so they were quite isolated. One afternoon, my grandmother was cooking and my mother and her sisters were cleaning. Suddenly, a deep bark came out of nowhere. My grandmother stopped as a cold breeze chilled her body. Suddenly, a deep bark came out of nowhere. My grandmother stopped as a cold breeze chilled the air. My mother and everyone else noticed. They all scattered through the house and closed the doors and windows, as this was a sign of something sinister coming. As the doors were shut, a growl could be heard at the front door, and it was getting closer and closer. This animal sounded larger than an average dog, and they knew very well that this was no dog. My grandmother went up to a window to take a glimpse to what would be a hellhound. From what she could see, it was dog-like in appearance, but with a thick black coat, and that was all that she could see. She then whispers everyone to huddle into a corner. The hellhound seemed to know exactly where they were, as the growl could be heard from the other side of the wall. But my grandmother tells everyone to pray the Lord's Prayer. This only seemed to anger the creature as it began to claw the walls, and its barks and growls getting more and more aggressive. They pray louder and louder, and then the creature lets out a howl as it seems to fade away, and then a large thump can be heard. The nightmare was over. But what happened? I asked. My grandmother says that the earth swallowed it back to hell. Throughout the Americas, there's always a version of some kind of shapeshifter, from skinwalker to the nagual. Here in Mexico, they go by many names, but most of the time, we just call them brujos or brujas. It is very common to have a local practitioner of both the dark magic and white. In my town, we had a legend about a very strong brujo who was very skilled in black magic. The story goes that this brujo lived at the edge of the neighborhood, slightly hidden by thick brush and a couple trees. He mostly kept to himself and didn't bother anybody. Well, at least not in human form. He was thought to be such a skilled brujo that he turned himself into whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He was mostly known to turn into a black cat. He liked to mess with the locals, from scaring them to taking their stuff. One guy, known as Lino, grew tired of El Brujo messing with him and his liquor. So he decided to set up a trap for this cat. He took a large butcher knife and hid it under his clothes and pretended to fall asleep on his hammock. He then waited, and sure enough, the black cat hopped onto the table. He waited for the opportune moment. He waited for the cat to turn his back on him, and once it did, he struck, cutting the cat's tail in half. The cat screamed and ran. Lino yelled at it to never come back. For the next few days, no one heard from El Brujo. And one day, a man was walking through the pass as he saw a small trail of blood which grew larger into pools. As he got closer, the trail of blood led to the house of El Brujo. Curious and terrified, he went up and knocked on the door, and it swung open. And there, in the pool of blood, El Brujo was laying on the ground, with a large gash on his back. He quickly ran out of that house and told the local townsman. Later that night, they burned the house to pay respect to El Brujo. We all assumed that would be the end of El Brujo, but a couple years later, Lino died from being stabbed in the back and being found in his home in the same pool of blood. A strange coincidence, I suppose. I've been a cook for some time, and I met this guy named Daniel. Daniel is from Guatemala. He immigrated here from when he was a teen. One day we were having lunch, and he told me how he got here and how much of a terrifying experience it was passing through Mexico. He told me that there were stories of people going missing during the journey. They were small groups, so it would be really hard for someone to go missing without a trace. He told me when he was crossing the border into Mexico, El Coyote would have him hold on to a rope to follow him in the pitch black dark. Keep in mind that they're all within arm's reach. And once they arrived to the other side, a group of 15 people could end up being a group of 13. By the time they arrived, there were no screams or any trace of them. Sometimes a group of 10 could be 14, and when you asked where they were or where they came from, they would have no recollection of what happened, as if they just were cut out from time and put back in at a different moment. This would freak out the coyotes, since there was no answer for how they disappeared or reappeared. Despite their best efforts, it kept on happening. Los coyotes made it very clear that they have no time to look for you if you go missing. This led to many, including los coyotes, to silently pray as they walked into these places, praying to God that they too would not get lost in the dark. I have never witnessed anything supernatural yet, but I know never to fuck with it, because it can come and fuck up your life if you don't know what you're doing. This story is about my uncle who passed a while ago, but I remember him through this story. My grandmother also told me this story from her point of view, so I know both sides of this story. My uncle lives in a couple houses down from my grandma, so sometimes he would come and help her with her garden. My grandmother is not one of those to get into fights or into feuds with other people in our neighborhood. This becomes important later on. While my grandma finished her morning routine, she noticed a makeshift pouch from a rag that was holding something on a tree. She approached it, but her gut was telling her to leave it, and the feeling got strong. She approached it, but a gut feeling was telling her to leave it. And as she got closer, the feeling grew strong. Not wanting to tempt fate, she left it and moved on with her day. The next day, my uncle came by to help her. As my grandma tended one side of the garden, she heard my uncle scream. She quickly ran to him to find that he opened the rag. She asked what happened, and he frantically explains that he saw the pouch and opened it, and when he did, all the feeling on his left arm left. He could not move it no matter how hard he tried. She took him to the doctor's office, and there was nothing they could do, or any way they could explain this phenomenon. They were dumbfounded. My grandma, desperate to find help from my uncle, she turned to a local witch doctor. She told him what happened, and like he had seen this before, he quickly went and got a couple things. He came back with a couple herbs, sugar, and a sheet of tinfoil. They both watched as he began to chant something and began to add the herbs onto the sheet, and then placed the sugar and folded it, then placed it on my uncle's arm. They all watched and waited. Suddenly, smoke began spewing out from the thing, and my uncle began to panic as he thought he was on fire. The witch doctor told him to not move it, as it was supposed to happen. A couple seconds later, after the smoke dissipates, he removes it from his arm and proceeds to open it. As he does, the white sugar was now black, like if it was actually burnt, which made no sense, as he did not light it. He then proceeds to say, "Someone placed a curse on you, but do not worry, it's absorbed the dark energy from your body. You'll be fine now. Try lifting your arm." Nervous, my uncle looks at his arm and proceeds to lift it. Nervous, my uncle looks at his arm, and sure enough, it begins to move. The feeling returns back to his arm. A huge sigh of relief waged over them, and they thanked and paid the man and left. My grandma was happy, but nervous. Who could have done this? Was it meant for her? And why did they do it? Those questions were never answered, and nothing like that ever happened again. Greetings, everyone. I have returned from the dark. Be sure to subscribe and give a like if you enjoyed it. I will see you soon. And remember, you should always fear the dark.